Atlanta, a major city in the southern United States, is known for its cultural diversity and rich history. However, beneath its glamorous exterior, the city harbors many deep-rooted social issues: a high crime rate, persistent racial discrimination, and a widening gap between the rich and the poor. In the midst of this, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Alexander emerges as a symbol of hope and justice. A middle-aged black man, Charles is distinguished, principled, and deeply committed to his work and community. He is not only a model police officer, but also a loving husband and father. That evening, after a long and exhausting day, Charles drove his familiar car through the streets of Atlanta. His mind was burdened with concerns about the city's deteriorating security. Crime was becoming increasingly complex, and he couldn't help but worry. A fateful encounter. Stopping at a convenience store to grab dinner, Charles unexpectedly crossed paths with a group of rowdy young white men. They gathered at the street corner, speaking loudly, using foul language, and even disturbing the public peace. Feeling uneasy about their behavior, Charles approached and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "Gentlemen, please keep it down. This is a residential area, and people need to rest." One of the young men turned to Charles with a defiant smirk. "Who do you think you are telling us what to do?" "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Alexander, a police officer in this district," Charles replied. The young man sneered. "A police officer? More like a black cop." Charles remained composed. He refused to let their words provoke him. "I don't care what you think of me. I just want you to respect those around you," he said. "We don't need anyone lecturing us," another young man retorted. "Get lost before we get angry." Charles sighed. He knew that reasoning with people like them was futile. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. Just as he was about to start the engine, a rock suddenly struck his windshield, cracking it instantly. Furious, Charles stepped out and confronted the group. "That was completely out of line. Vandalizing private property is a crime." "So what? What are you going to do about it?" one of the men sneered. Charles didn't waste any more words. He pulled out his radio and called the police department. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Alexander. I need immediate assistance at the intersection of 5th Street and Main." As he waited for backup, Charles carefully studied each of the young men's faces, memorizing their features and actions. He knew this wasn't just a minor altercation. It was a reflection of a much bigger issue: racial prejudice and the blatant disregard for the law. Within minutes, Officer John Smith and several colleagues arrived at the scene. Smith, a young white officer with limited experience, quickly assessed the situation. The group of young men immediately shifted the blame onto Charles, claiming that he had provoked them first. "That guy started it," one of them insisted. "He was trying to lecture us, so we just defended ourselves." Smith, carrying deep-seated racial biases, was skeptical of Charles's account. He looked at Charles with distrust, even contempt. Despite Charles presenting his badge and identification, Smith accused him of impersonation. Charles felt deeply insulted. He protested, but Smith refused to listen. Instead, he ordered his men to handcuff Charles and escort him to the police station. As Charles was taken away, the group of young men laughed among themselves, reveling in their perceived victory. They had no idea that their actions had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to serious consequences. A costly misunderstanding. At the police station, Charles was placed in a small, cold interrogation room. The steel door slammed shut behind him with a loud clang, sealing him off from the outside world. He sat on a metal chair, his hands cuffed, a deep sense of frustration and betrayal welling up inside him. He couldn't believe this was happening. He was a lieutenant colonel, a dedicated officer who had devoted his life to protecting his community. Yet, here he was, handcuffed and detained simply because of his skin color. His self-respect was deeply wounded. He thought about the countless struggles he had endured to rise through the ranks. As a black officer, he had to work twice, even 3 times as hard as his white colleagues to prove his competence. Yet, with one simple misunderstanding, all his efforts seemed meaningless. He knew that racism still thrived in society. He had seen it in the way people looked at him, in the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways they dismissed him. But experiencing it firsthand in such a blatant manner was something else entirely. Would he be suspended? Would this incident tarnish his career? Would his family suffer because of it? Lost in thought, Charles barely noticed when John Smith entered the room. The young officer's face was filled with guilt and shame. "Lieutenant Colonel Alexander, I'm sorry," Smith stammered. "I misunderstood the situation." Charles met his gaze with cold eyes. "You misunderstood? You handcuffed me, treated me like a criminal, and now you call it a misunderstanding?" Smith lowered his head. "I know I was wrong. I was blinded by my own prejudices. I sincerely apologize for everything," Charles sighed. "I don't hold it against you. I know that many people still carry harmful biases against people of color, but I hope that after today, you will start seeing things differently." Smith nodded. "I promise I will. I won't let my prejudices cloud my judgment ever again." Charles studied Smith's face. He wanted to believe him, but he also knew that changing ingrained beliefs wasn't easy. "I hope you keep that promise. No one should go through what I did just because of the color of their skin." Smith nodded once more. "I'll do my best. I'll learn to respect and treat everyone equally, regardless of race or background." Charles stood up, walked over, and placed a hand on Smith's shoulder. "I believe in you. I believe you will become a better officer, one who truly stands for justice." Smith felt a surge of emotion. He looked up at Charles, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "I'll never forget what you taught me today." Charles smiled. So he knew that his meeting with Smith wasn't just a coincidence. It was an opportunity for change, a chance to heal the wounds caused by racial injustice. Charles decides to take action. That night, Charles lay awake in bed, unable to sleep. The events at the police station kept replaying in his mind. He thought about all the hardships he had endured to get to where he was today. Born into a poor working-class family in Atlanta, Charles had witnessed racial injustice firsthand from a young age. His father was a factory worker, his mother a homemaker. Life had never been easy. He had grown up watching the unfair treatment of Black people in society, the systemic racism embedded in every institution. Determined to change the system from within, Charles had chosen to become a police officer. He wanted to prove that justice should not be determined by skin color. He had worked relentlessly, overcoming countless obstacles, climbing the ranks while facing discrimination at every turn. And yet, despite all his efforts, he was still seen as less than, still treated as if he didn't belong. Now, more than ever, Charles knew he couldn't stay silent. He couldn't allow this to happen to anyone else. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for those who had no voice. Facing resistance. Determined, Charles began gathering support from fellow Black officers and members of the community who shared his vision. They started speaking out against racial bias within the police force, demanding accountability and reform. But change never comes easy. Pressure from superiors. Charles's superiors were quick to respond, not with support, but with threats. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Riley, a white officer and Charles's direct superior, called him into his office. "Charles, I understand you're upset," Riley said, his voice laced with condescension. "But you need to think carefully before taking this any further. You're not just representing yourself, you're representing the entire Atlanta Police Department." "With all due respect, sir," Charles replied, "I can't ignore this. I can't accept that an officer, someone who has dedicated his life to justice, was treated like a criminal just because of his race." Riley sighed. "I get it, I do. But stirring things up won't help anyone. If you keep pushing, you could lose your job. You could even put yourself in danger." "I'm not afraid," Charles said firmly. "If standing up for justice costs me my badge, so be it." Isolation from colleagues. Charles soon found himself alienated by many of his white colleagues. They viewed him as a troublemaker, someone trying to divide the department rather than unify it. Some officers avoided him altogether. Others spread rumors, calling him ambitious, attention-seeking, or even a traitor. Sergeant David Miller, one of Charles's closest colleagues, approached him one day. "Charles, I support what you're doing, but you need to be careful," Miller warned. "A lot of people in the department don't see things the way you do. They think you're making a big deal out of nothing." "This isn't nothing, David," Charles shot back. Racism in law enforcement is real, and ignoring it won't make it disappear. I know, Miller admitted, but I don't want to see you get hurt because of this. Smear campaign by the media. The media soon caught wind of Charles's actions. While some outlets supported him, others painted him as a radical trying to dismantle the police force. Headlines twisted the narrative. Rogue officer causes division within Atlanta PD. Is Charles Alexander a hero or a troublemaker? Black officer sparks controversy over racial bias allegations. Some journalists even harassed Charles's family, pressuring his wife and son for interviews. His wife, Sarah, had to work extra hours to help cover legal costs, while their son, Michael, took on part-time jobs to support the household. Threats from extremist groups. It wasn't long before Charles became a target. White supremacist groups sent him death threats, vandalized his home, and even followed his family. One night, as Charles was driving home, a group of masked men ambushed him. They beat him viciously, kicking him to the ground. "Stay in your place, boy," one of them hissed. "If you don't shut up, next time we'll make sure you don't get back up." Bleeding and bruised, Charles refused to back down. "Do whatever you want," he spat, "but you won't financial struggles." On top of everything, Charles was struggling financially. He had to hire lawyers, pay for security, and organize protests, all while still supporting his family. But despite everything, he refused to give up. The community began to rally behind him. Protests erupted across Atlanta. Thousands took to the streets demanding justice, accountability, and an end to racial profiling. The fight had begun. John Smith's transformation. Meanwhile, Officer John Smith was undergoing his own transformation. After his wrongful arrest of Charles, Smith couldn't shake the guilt eating away at him. He realized that he had spent his entire career making snap judgments about Black people, viewing them with suspicion without even realizing it. Determined to change, Smith started educating himself. He read books, watched documentaries, and spoke to Black colleagues about their experiences. For the first time, he truly listened, and he didn't like what he heard. The more he learned, the more disgusted he became with his own past behavior. One day, he gathered his courage and went to see Charles. "Lieutenant Colonel Alexander, I need to apologize again. I was wrong, and I want to do better." Charles studied Smith's face. This time, he saw sincerity. "Then prove it," Charles said. "Don't just apologize. Do something." A powerful line. Smith didn't just apologize, he took action. He joined Charles's movement, using his position as a white officer to advocate for police reform. Together, they investigated cases of racial discrimination within the force, exposing corruption and misconduct. It wasn't easy. They faced backlash, threats, and even sabotage, but they pressed on. Their efforts eventually led to policy changes within the department. And racial bias training became mandatory. Officers were held accountable for misconduct. The department was forced to confront its deep-rooted issues. Justice prevails. The young men who had attacked Charles were arrested and charged. The officers who had mistreated him faced disciplinary action. Most importantly, Charles's name was cleared. He was reinstated with full honors, recognized for his courage and integrity. And John Smith? He became a better officer, a fairer, more just enforcer of the law. He and Charles formed an unlikely but powerful partnership, proving that change was possible. A message of hope. The story ends with a message of hope. Change is difficult. Injustice is deeply rooted. But if people are willing to listen, to learn, and to stand up for what's right, the world can be different. And it starts with just one voice refusing to be silenced.